Welcome to day 16 of the 365 PIF Talk series, Rock Out Motherhood through Life Coach University. Our one ask here is that you pay it forward with an act of kindness. Hi, I'm Lani Kim, and you're here to rock out motherhood with me. Today's surprise topic is going to be topping the charts or not. So it's in line with the theme of this week, which is the explicit version. So we went over defining the explicit version, writing your song, recording your song, and releasing your song. So today, right, the song is released and topping the charts or not. What happens when things don't go according to plan? What if you don't get the results that you expected? What do we do now? So today we're going to go over three main parts. One is going to be your why, then your identity, then moving forward. So after your time here, you will walk away knowing that what you planned, even if it doesn't, even if your results are not as planned, it doesn't mean it's failure. And also, what do you do about that? What is the next step, right? So often in life, when things don't go when we expected, we start to feel, we start to freeze, right? We feel overwhelmed. We don't know what to do. What next? That's all I know how to do, right? These are ways that we often talk to ourselves. Or what if it happens again, right? So I want you to have the confidence to know that after you've released your song, if you haven't already done so, what then if things don't go as expected? And realistically, things don't go as we expected most of the time. And this is really to remember that whenever you do anything, right, you are going for how you want to feel through that process. So the only reason why anything is wrong when we try something and it doesn't meet our expectations is really how we feel about it, right? It has nothing to do so much with the actual result. It really has to do with the way we feel about it. And this process that we're going through does not only relate to your gift and talent, it relates to all areas of life whenever you have an expectation and it doesn't come out as you planned, right? So what do we do about that? So number one, revisit your why. So often we lose focus on our why. Because we have to remember that if this is something we either haven't done for a while or is new to us, that all the thoughts, this whole process that you've gone through this week and last week, right? The week before, these are all new. And even if you're revisiting a talent or gift you already have, you are in a different stage of life. So you are thinking about it differently. And what I mean by differently is sometimes even if the maybe thought itself is the same, it might be different in your sense of priorities and values right now. And because you're a mom or a parent, or maybe a later stage of life, right? So values and priorities can change. So revisit your why and remember that this is new stuff, right? So for instance, if you are practicing for a play or as a rock star, right? you are practicing a song. You wouldn't expect yourself to know the song from the first get-go, right? From the first run through or rehearsal. You would know that there's going to be times you make a mistake or forget something, forget some part of it. And that's totally expected. So it's fine, right? So if you know that that's expected, then it's fine, right? It doesn't mean that we may not feel a sense of frustration or disappointment, but we have resolved to continue to move forward, right? We have told ourselves, this is normal, this happens, and we move forward. It's when we tell the story that if we don't get the result we want, or if it's not executed exactly the way we expected, something has gone wrong. That is when we stop. That is when we have the freeze response, right? The sense of overwhelm, just because we emotionally didn't create kind of like room for that discomfort, that frustration, that disappointment, right? Maybe even shame, humiliation. So, but, right, when, for instance, I think of the times that I've tried something new. So, for instance, one time my daughter is an actress and I went out on an audition with her. And at the last minute, they asked me to audition because they were really wanting real families. This is not my jam. And so I auditioned and I just told myself ahead of time, it doesn't matter. Because quite frankly, it doesn't, just because I didn't do well in the audition, her audition was separate. So I had that pressure off my back. But it was totally fine. This is not what I typically do. It was spur of the moment. And yeah, it was an awkward experience for me, but it's something I think about maybe once every 3 years, just because it's kind of funny. But to me, I didn't tell myself anything's gone wrong, right? That sense of discomfort I had and awkwardness totally to me was normal. And it just wasn't a big deal, right? So, and by the way, no, I didn't get a call back for that. So, but even then, I don't even think I was thinking about a callback when I left that, because I had no expectation from it. And so really remember how powerful your thoughts are towards whatever you're doing, right? So whatever circumstance you're dealing with. So here you are, you've released your song, your gift, your talent, you've put it out there, right? And the results don't match, right, with what you expected. So remember that the thoughts, this process that you've gone through is new. So it's not going to be tethered tightly into your brain, as tightly as other thoughts, I should say, right? All the doubts and fears that you've had all these years that prevented you in the first place from putting out your gift or your talent, right? Those are so strong. There's literally those neural connections are really strong. And so these new neural connections, these new thoughts that you have, they're just not as strong. And so you have to come back to your why, because you do have to remind yourself. It is something literally you do have to remind yourself about. And so it's unpracticed. The way I like to think about it is it's just unpracticed. And and the other way I think about this is when I was a public school teacher, there was a process to become a public school teacher. So I went through my training, and then towards the end of your education for your teaching credential, at least here in the US, at least back when I did it, it was a step-by-step process of first you observe hours in a teacher's classroom, then you might present a lesson, And then eventually it takes you to being the full-time teacher for that class, right? So the students are calling you their teacher, the parents are calling you the teacher, and the teacher's calling you the teacher. However, you actually are not a teacher to the school district. You are not a paid employee. You're not actually even paid, and you're not an employee of the school district. So what does that leave you? Are you really a teacher or are you not? Right? There is no right or wrong answer. What I'm saying is the why behind all of this, defining what that is for you, is really what drives your sense of identity, which we're going to go into. So here's some questions to ask yourself, right? So at that point in my life, I had a decision when I finished my internship, and I needed / wanted a paid teaching position. Do I call myself a teacher? I don't know. My students did. The other teachers did. The parents did, right? It was just me, my self-concept, whether that was to me a teacher or did I need to actually get into a classroom and be paid. But that comes down to my why, right? How do I define what a teacher is for myself, right? And it goes into the why. So number one, are you performing your gift or talent for yourself or for others? And there's no right or wrong answer to that. There really isn't. But there's two things to define within that question is what is the feeling you want from that experience, right? So for instance, for me, I have this just joy from seeing people learn, not any specific subject, just to learn, to see those aha moments and to keep going forward. And the building of confidence within themselves to know that they can learn. That process is amazing to me. And to me, that's what a teacher does. And whether it's paid or not, whether it's science, which is my background, or history, or how to rock out motherhood, it doesn't matter, right? So right now, you're watching me as a life coach telling you how to rock out motherhood, and you may not necessarily be paying for this part of information, right? Some of this I've shared in other platforms, right? That doesn't take away from my identity as a life coach. Just because the information I'm putting out there at that moment may not be paid for, right? Doesn't mean it takes away from my identity as a life coach, right? So because my why, the experience I want is for my clients to have their aha moments, because that is what brings me happiness or satisfaction. I don't even know if it's happiness, it's a sense of satisfaction to me, right? And for me, a lot of it is inspiration to keep on doing it. I feel inspired when I see my clients, and in the past, my students, those light bulbs going off. I find it inspirational. That's the feeling I want. And that's why I'm able to do so much that is not paid for. Because that in of itself doesn't define who I am as a life coach. Or even as a teacher, it wasn't the money. Does the money come from it? Yes. But it's not the essential foundational why. It's just a natural consequence of being inspired and wanting to tell people things, to help people, to work with people. The payment comes later. And then the other question to ask yourself is, not only the feeling you want, but what is the feeling you want your audience to have? What is that feeling you want your audience to experience? So there's that. Okay, there's your feelings, the feelings from your audience. They're not necessarily the same. They might be, but they may not be. And the reason to tease these apart is because when our results don't match our expectations, our plans, I want you to see that your experience and the experience of your audience are two different models. It's the same circumstance, but it's two different models, right? The thoughts in my head are not the thoughts in my audience's head, and I have to separate them apart because I may go on and think, so for instance, even this webinar, right? I could think, I hope that 100 people see it, right? Now, creating the webinar in of itself has nothing to do with how many people see it. It really doesn't. But to me, my audience's experience obviously needs people to watch it, right? So what if no one watches it? That doesn't take away from my experience of creating it. I just love that part of it. It's such a joy to me to get that information out, right? It's like practicing my craft. Kind of like when I played sports and I practiced, I wasn't always necessarily, so for instance, basketball, that doesn't mean the whole time I was working on making points. Sometimes I was working on my dribbling skills. And actually, for me, in the position I played, it was dribbling skills. It actually had nothing to do with the actual points. I mean, obviously, that was part of my contribution, but that was not per se part of my foundational role, right? That was like the center's role, the forward's role, they're closer to the basket. So in this way, right, how many people see this is entirely different than my experience creating it, practicing my craft, honing my craft. Because even if nobody sees this, I got to practice my craft, and it's going to inspire me to do something either different, like maybe another version of this, or something completely different. And that's what comes from that practice. But that has nothing to do with the experience my audience has, right? So know your why, because that is so integral when your expected results don't match your actual results. And then keep in mind too that if you put yourself on a timeline, right, you have to be really careful. I'm not saying that timelines are a negative thing. They're neutral. It's how does that timeline make you feel about your results, right? So if you don't hit the goal in a month, in 2 months, in a year, whatever it was, is it working against you, right? Or do you eliminate the timeline because the experience that you wanted, the feelings you wanted are there, right? It's only the fact that there's a timeline on them that makes you feel less than, have negative emotions. So when people say, well, of course I didn't hit my goal in 45 days, right? Well, let's tease it apart. Is it that you didn't hit your goal, or is it you didn't hit your goal in that amount of time, right? So be really careful with that because people skip over the timeline part and then they become so frustrated with their experience looking back in retrospect, even though they were actually enjoying the experience. But it's when that timeline's not met, they turn around and they start to negatively view the experience that they had. So be careful of that. Okay. So that's your why. So look at that. Where have you not defined it for yourself? Or where do you need to practice it some more? Right? The thoughts that you do want towards what it is that you're doing. Okay. And then notice, right, at the same time, what neural connections, what thoughts are really strong, and be aware of those. And there's two things you could just decide not to allow yourself to continue on that thought, right? So if a thought comes, you could say, no, just not having it. I'm putting it in the trash can. That may not be easy for everyone, or you can decide to make room for that thought, right? Ooh, that makes me feel a sense of shame, discomfort, humiliation, disappointment, anxiety, and examine it, right? And say, okay, so this sentence in my head makes me feel. Or if you don't have that exact thought, I'm feeling, right? And then processing it. So either way, you get to choose. Okay, so that's your why. Now let's go into your identity, which is foundationally built upon your why. Is an artist always an artist, right? Is a mom always a mom? So the reason I ask these questions is there a criteria, right? Just like when I talked about teaching, people think there's a criteria. There's no real defined criteria. There's a vague idea, right? And we may only want part of that that vague idea, or maybe it's so vague that that is part of it, but there's other parts to the definition, right? Our definition of what makes us us, right? Whatever you want your title to be, right? So know what your title is, right? Your gift and talent. What title are you giving yourself other than rock star? Okay. Now ask yourself, is there really truly a criteria? Right? And then remember to do this for the pleasure of your creativity, right? Because so often we are so fixed and attached to the exact results that we're doing it for the exact result. And so we want to be really careful with that, because remember, the result can come in all different forms. And so if our journey is what we want it to be, and the result is a little bit different, don't let that mean it's a failure, because the journey is the longest part of it, right? So if you look at an Olympic athlete and they swim a race and they don't get the expected result, are you going to tell them all the training they've done is worthless? Are you going to tell them, oh, there's no growth there? You didn't learn anything? No, right? Just at that moment, the result isn't what they expected for many different reasons, right? It is not that circumstance that determines their worth or how they feel about the journey. So we need to be really careful with that. That unspoken, sometimes we feel there's an unspoken criteria, but when you really break it down, you probably don't even actually know what it is if you haven't defined it for yourself, right? There is no actual real criteria, right? Now, there may be parts of this unspoken criteria that we don't meet, and then we start to tell ourselves, oh, that's not us. We're not really an artist, right? But if that's not part of your criteria, what does it matter, right? So for me, being paid to be a teacher was not really part of my criteria for being an actual teacher, right? So keep that in mind. do this for your creativity, because your creativity is what's going to get you your result. If you do it for the pleasure of the result, that's not a good place to come from, because you're not going to get your result till you get your result. So that whole time, that journey is going to feel a lot less satisfactory. It might feel actually empty, right? Because the journey is just like, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm not even enjoying it, but for the sake of the result. So be really careful with that, right? Do this for your pleasure of creativity, not the result. Okay, the other thing is to keep in mind, like, there are no absolute truths. There are just incidences, right? And what I mean by when we experience something, that one incidence is not the full truth of something. It's maybe part of the truth, right? But it's not the whole truth. Because when we experience something, right, we have a limited perspective. So we can never say that that's the absolute truth. It could be part of the truth, but it's not the absolute truth, right? Just like being an Olympic athlete, while you may stand and get the gold medal, also includes times where you place last or place not first, right? So if you would take that time that that Olympic athlete didn't place first and expand that to mean that they couldn't be a gold medalist, or you wouldn't title them a gold medalist. We would never do that. We call them a gold medalist because even if they did it once, that's still part of their truth, right? That incident, right? So it is not, one incident is not the whole entire holistic truth. It's an incidence, right? And the other thing I wanted you to understand, right? Because this has to do with your identity, right? And I think about, there's this show called Three's Company from, I think, the 70s. And the whole show was based upon people hearing things out of context, right? And you just have these hilarious um, um, I don't know, experience, like just watching all these little parts of people taking things out of context and what they started to think from that. So just remember that an incident, right, is a snippet. Don't take it out of context, right? And then what I want to say is thinking that someone or something else outside of you has the power to make you happy and make your problems go away is really giving away your responsibility to all of this. You're telling yourself that other people are responsible for this, for how you feel, for your experience, right? You are attached to the outcome in a way, right, that really puts responsibility on other people. You're abdicating your responsibility, you're giving it away. When you do that, you really give away your power. And when you give away your power, right, you are not going to create out of who you are, you're going to create out of the circumstances around you, right? People pleasing. So the way I think about this is, why do we do the things that we do? Because we love to, right? Look at little children. They don't care, right? That's why in the middle of a restaurant, right, they'll decide to chuck the fork. They'll decide to take the soup and spill it all over themselves, right? That's why they'll scream. They don't care. They're just being themselves. No care for their audience. And that is where we have to take ourselves back to. Not caring. Not caring about anything, but I mean, not caring and being attached to, right? How other people receive it. It's good feedback, and we may or may not think it's valid. We may or may not want that to influence how we conduct ourselves in the future, but it doesn't take away from our worth. It doesn't take away from our gifts and talents, right? Who we are. And then what I want to also offer you, right, is, again, going back to this idea of incidences, all you do are incidences. You can break them up however small you want. And when you break them up, just remember, right, that the result is not who you are, but it is a reflection of what you were feeling at the time. So it's, again, right, coming back to like athletes when they have a slump. So if you're a Olympic swimmer, a gold medalist, and you have a slump, we're not going to take away the title of gold medalist. You're a gold medalist. You carry that with you always. Now, you may swim a race and place third, right? You may go through a slump because it's a reflection of how you were feeling at the time, right? And that's why in sports, it's just not this physical training, it's a mental training, right? Because we're humans, and life does affect how we feel. And unless we have someone come along to help us, or ourselves to feel empowered to tell ourselves that's not necessarily true, right? Just because I'm feeling not so great doesn't mean I am not so great, right? So remember that the result that you get is a reflection of a feeling you have at the time, right? And so for an athlete, if you are an amazing athlete, but you get performance anxiety, right? So you at practice may be amazing. You have the fastest time. You're always first. And then it comes to performance time and you get the jitters, right? And you place third, fourth, fifth. It's because at that moment you were feeling nervous, anxious, right? It's just at that moment you got the result that you got because in that moment that athlete was feeling nervous, right? It's just at that moment that result is as of that moment. It's not because that person themselves hasn't worked hard, is unworthy, right? Or is not qualified or talented. So know what your identity is through this process. Because the why and identity, right, which your identity is built on your why, when you know that, when things don't go as expected, you may still feel disappointed, and that's totally fine. And I would think normal, right? But it doesn't sway you from still getting that result. Trying again. And it's just like, oh, that was an incident. If I keep on going, that's just going to be an incident in a longer journey towards my result. But yeah, if you stop at the end of that one incident and let it say everything about you, you won't have that greater journey to then say, oh, that was an incident, right? That will be your experience. But that's only if you choose that, right? You can still keep on going. But if you choose to stop, right? Stopping by meaning like you want to keep going, but you are stopping because of that sense of feeling of failure, even sometimes guilt. You didn't get the result you wanted. And, as moms, right, that mom guilt, like, oh my gosh, I spent so much time away from my family, right? And I didn't get the result I expected, so I'm going to stop, right? And two things, because this is a reality. If you feel that, go back to your priorities and values, right? How are you prioritizing your values, right? Because that will allow you to make a decision with peace, right? If you decide to say, no more, right? Because my priorities are, then you get to make that decision with peace. But if you're like, well, it's up here, but I have this guilt, right? You're going to leave that and you're going to have regret. So come back to that. If things don't go the way expected and you're dealing with that mom guilt, right? Then also remember, your kids are going to do things in life and fail, right? They're not going to meet their expectations. Are you going to tell them to give up? No, because it's not about them achieving exactly that result, right? It's about their growth, right? And the result is just this arbitrary thing we put out there so we can take the journey, right? Just like a trip. Many times the trip is actually not the point. It's the journey, right? Enjoying your time with your family, discovering new places, right? So just remember um, that the result is often just the marker to help us go through the journey, right? And so if you're dealing with that mom guilt, right, just remember at the same time all that you have taught your kids, right? Discipline, right? Discipline to do something, right? Even the process to even set something in motion, right, takes a lot of discipline to get it defined in your head, to try new things. It's a discipline in of itself. So remind yourself of that, right? And then moving forward, what do we do from here? I mean, I touched a little bit about it right now, right? If you're dealing with the mom guilt, but I want to ask you, what are you willing to feel to keep going? And again, go back to your values and priorities. If your sense of comfort supersedes, right, for me, so for instance, teaching, right? If I couldn't get a teaching job and I had to apply again and again, right? I decide whether my sense of comfort, right, in not being like, because it came with rejection, I didn't get a job, I was rejected. If this is what happened, rejected, and I don't like that feeling, is my sense of comfort more important and more of a priority than the inspiration I feel when I see people learning? I get to answer that for myself, right? So what are you willing to feel? What are you unwilling to feel? And that's totally fine, right? So for me, feeling angry, right? So feeling a sense of, I think probably rejection is something that I'm sensitive to, right? So sometimes I'll make the decision like, no, in this incident, I'm not willing to feel a sense of rejection. And that's it. The journey ends here, right? And then there are times I am, right? So when you go through this, right, know that you do have to build or have resolve, right? You have to have or build resolve to do these things, right? You must know what you are crafting, right? So if your kids say they want to play soccer, even if they never win a game? Do they get to continue to play? What are you crafting? Are you crafting a skill of doing things for pleasure, learning new things, discipline, teamwork, learning to take instruction from other people, learning to take criticism? Or is it solely because they were supposed to win 5 games? Right? So know what you are crafting. Is it a person who always has to have the most points, right? Going back to the soccer, right? Is it crafting a child who always has to have the most points, or any of the other things I just mentioned, right? And then again, for whose pleasure, right? So be careful of the people pleasing versus doing something for your own pleasure. And this is even something as moms to take into other parts of our lives, right? Because sometimes we are kid pleasing, right? Or parent pleasing, right? Like there's other parents around us. We want to please them, right? Now, there's nothing wrong with that in of itself, right? But if that starts to encroach into your identity, right, be careful of that, right? So when you have, if things don't go well, right, who's defining that? Is it the people around you and you're trying to people please and you thought, nah, that's actually pretty cool, right? Be careful of that, right? Or if someone tells you to stop, are you doing that to people please them, right? For whose pleasure, right? And the last part is forecasting and role playing, right? So to me, they're kind of, I mean, well, they are related, but I like to kind of separate them. To me, the forecasting is more the mental game of what do we want now out of this, right? Looking ahead. How would you, in a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, look back at the person who has just gone through this journey of making their song, releasing their song? It didn't go as they expected. How would you want to view that version of yourself? Right? Forecasting, right? Because I guarantee you, for the most part, we would be very kind and we would say that person was brave, right? And even more brave to continue if they wanted to, right? And so this also brings me to role playing, because now you do the role playing, right? You kind of forecast in your head, like, what would it mean like to look back, right? Or forecasting forward as to what do we want our journey to look like? So forecasting who we are going to be in the future, right? And so two parts of that is planning to be that person in the future, but then also how would that person view me right now, right? Yourself right now. How would your future version of yourself view yourself right now, right? You're not going to get to your future person if you don't take the steps you're taking right now, right? So that's kind of like the forecasting. And then there's a role playing of getting into that mindset, right? Who do I want to be in the future, right? Do I want to be the person who was criticizing myself? Or do I want to be the person to say, okay, regroup, right? Plan B, or maybe it's not even plan B, maybe it's just, okay, so we're going to shift our focus, or we're going to change a little bit about the journey, right? It's kind of like Google Maps, right? You can, when it gives you your, when it gives you the map, it often has different routes, right? Do you want to go there the fastest, the not driving the freeways, least amount of turns, no U-turns, right? And all of them will get you to your result, right? It's not always based on time. It's sometimes based on experience. And here in Southern California, time is how we measure our commutes or when we are going anywhere. It doesn't have to do with miles because 5 miles in one area can take 5 times as long to get to as 5 miles in another area. And so when I look, sometimes I don't care about the time, it's how much traffic there is, right? So even if I have to drive 5 miles out of my way, right, but it's more scenic, there's not as many stoplights, I'll take that route because I don't want to be stuck in traffic, right? So role playing, right? I want to be the person who's enjoying that experience, even if it takes me a little bit longer, right? I want to get out of the traffic. That's the experience I want. So forecasting and role playing. All right. You have left with your why. You've built your identity upon that, and you know how to move forward. So go rock out motherhood. Thanks for joining me for day 16 of the 365 PIF Talk series through Life Coach University. Our one ask here is that you pay it forward. All right, I'll see you for day 17.